Well, so many thanks to Melanie and Tahara for setting this up and for inviting me back to Oxford. Tonight, or this afternoon rather, I'll be talking about several areas. One is identifying the polluter elite, then about how they use their power, and lastly, what we can do to counter it. So we've just heard about the gravity of the situation. So my research really builds on decades of that research, whether that's the climate science or people who have done work on lobbying, etc. What I want to do today is look at who is most responsible and then inspire you, and I think most of you are already inspired, but inspire you even more to take action. The reason I did my research is I felt that there was a bit of a gap in the links between inequality and the environment. I've been working on this area for too long, over a decade. I've been to some of these climate change conferences, I've done research, I've been on protests, but there's still a lot more to be done, obviously, and part of that, I think, is the kind of answer to that is in identifying who is more responsible and directly countering them, as you'll see. So, and just to say, I do have a book out, so if you want all the kind of academic references, you can go to that, or you can ask me at the end. Now, a question. What do you think of when you think of luxury lifestyles? Just shout out, or you can use the clue from the illustration.
Private jet.
Private jets, yeah, that's number one. Yachts. Anything else?
Unnecessary. Unnecessary.
Unnecessary, okay.
Lots of houses.
Yeah, lots of houses, big mansions.
Lots of wastage.
Wastage.
Gore-Tex.
What was that?
Gore-Tex.
Gore-Tex. I haven't had that one come up before. I'll ask for that in the next edition of the illustration. Okay, great. So, I mean, the things you shouted out are the obvious things that we think of. And so, when I started this research, I think it was 2015, I started looking at the private jets and the consumption, because obviously that's what you think of when you think of the richest people. And I did that precisely because, as Rachel mentioned, there hasn't been enough focus on the richest people. So we often talk about, say, I don't know, how carbon taxes would affect the poorest people, but there's not enough on what the rich are doing. So the reason it's also important to look at what they're up to is that at the moment, the main debate's about who is responsible, and often that is at the UN climate change talks. It's comparing between countries, so comparing the US and China, or the UK and China, or things like that. But what's happening within countries? Obviously, not everyone is consuming the same amount or in the same way. So, and what really matters is the volume of consumption and the amount of resources and pollution embedded in the goods that the richest own. So all of us in this room are part of this economy. Some people will have driven here, some people will have consumed something with plastic today, of course. I mean, that's the system that we're trying to change. But the richest people fly more frequently, they own more luxury cars, etc. So they are on a different level. And if you're interested in academic research, which actually estimates the differences, so the carbon inequality, then you can look at work done by Oxfam or by Thomas Piketty and Lucas Chancel. Currently, those are really the only studies which actually estimate within countries the differences of what's going on. Okay, I'd like you to talk to the person next to you for 2 minutes. What do you see?
Bad cycling. Demonish cycling. Not very good.
the focus of my book was on the United States and the United Kingdom. So the reason for that is there's large historical responsibility in terms of pollution, so greenhouse gas emissions. There are also two countries where there's a huge concentration of wealth, so high net worth individuals, people who have a net worth of more than $1 million. And it's also where people are getting richer. I probably don't need to tell you that. There's massive inequality in both of those countries. So that's why I focused on those places. And what happened is I started off with consumption, as you saw on the slide before. But what I realised was, if I only looked at consumption, so the way the top part of that cycle is just one component of what was going on. So that was I decided to also look at their political donations. This is more prevalent in the US than in the UK. It still exists in this country. The impact then on government decisions, and the fact that their wealth was derived from activities that cause pollution, and that cycle goes round and round. So it's not just that they fly in those private jets. It's where does the money come from as well. And so then when I wrote my book and the talks I'm giving, it's a more holistic picture of what's going on. And the reason I call these people the polluter elite, and the reason it's a older white male is also intentional, is to try and get beyond these being faceless companies. Because actually, as I mentioned at the start, my research builds on decades of other people's research, and they have pointed out that there's a fossil fuel lobby. We know it's there, we know exactly what it's doing, but we need maybe to have other angles which will help us to explore how to counter it, basically. So that's partly why I've used this device of the people who actually run the companies, as well as the company which maybe we would know household names like Shell, BP, etc. So it's to try and understand a bit more about how they think and how they operate, to then try and weaken them. Bear with me. Right, so as I was trying to figure out how to quantify the richest people's impact on the environment, it's incredibly difficult if you try and ask yourself that question. So what I did was, on the investment side, because the consumption side, in a way, we already know that the richest people fly more. It would be good to have more accurate data, but that's pretty much a given. I mean, look at what happens when they meet in Davos. I mean, we just know they have that luxury lifestyle. So on the investment side, though, it's actually a lot harder to try and quantify. So I created something called the Polluter Elite database. Here you're looking at BP. There are about 20 other companies in that database. And what I looked at was the executive team, so the CEOs, the CFOs, and the directors. And the reason I looked at them is because we know who they are, basically. In the company's annual report, they list the names and they list the amount of shares they hold. So I'll explain that in a second. So my definition for these members of the polluter elite, because the polluter elite can be, in some ways, anyone who's very rich and is profiting from destroying the planet, but in terms of these particular people, they are very rich, and if you go into the database, you'll see the value of their shares. I mean, millions of pounds or tens of millions of dollars. They hold many shares in the company, as I've just said, and then crucially, as decision makers at those companies, they hold more responsibility because they affect what we can consume. So what these companies try to pretend, and they're doing a lot of greenwash at the moment, and it is increasing, and because they're scared basically, they try to put it on us. They say that we want to consume their gas, or we want to drive our cars and use petrol. But actually, they're the ones who influence what options we have. So through the lobbying, through the donations to political parties, then miraculously more roads are built, or it's cheaper to drive, things like that. I mean, that's not just kind of circumstance, that it's designed like that, and there are people pushing for it to stay that way. So the point is, as decision makers, they hold more responsibility. So in terms of what I've done in this database is, as I said, a lot of it is public information, but I brought it together to basically illustrate how these individuals, and they could all be replaced, by the way, it's not just that these happen to be rotten apples or whatever it is, anyone who got into that position would probably do the same, is that it's to illustrate their buy-in, their interest in basically maintaining the fossil fuel status quo. So that's why there's information on the value of their shares. And then what I've done, and I won't go into it with the methodology now, you could look it up, Polluter Elite Database. I figured out the percentage of the company they owned on a specific date. And this was 31st of December 2015. You could do it for any year really, I picked that year. And I was using, the reason I focused on BP and these companies is because of work by Rachael Treharne, who did research on the carbon majors. So he identified the most polluting companies, state-owned, much higher, Saudi Arabia for example. I was looking at the investor-owned companies because that's where there's public information. And the point is that it's possible to figure out how the percentage share of the company that person owned on that day. All those figures change because their shares go up and down, share prices, etc. go up and down. But the point is to try and make a connection between their shareholding and the emissions of the company. So in this case, BP's annual emissions, as disclosed by BP, were around 51 million tonnes of CO2 in 2015. And then I'm connecting that to his share of the company, which is about 0.008%. And then saying, well, he is connected to just over 4,000 tonnes of BP's annual emissions. So it's symbolic, it's to illustrate what's going on, and that's never been done before. So the point is just to try and advance the conversation about linking wealth and emissions. And just a comparison in terms of the size of those tons of CO2. This is actually quite small. In the case of Bob Dudley, he's the CEO of BP. For the American CEOs, it's tens of thousands of tons. But so for Bob Dudley, I'm saying in 2015, his investment emissions were around 4,000 tons. For a long-haul flight from London to the US or to Australia, it's just a few tons. So just to give you an idea of the difference in size. So the good news is that there's more and more interest in the polluters, whether that's the companies or the people who run them. So on the right-hand side, you can see a poster talking about ecocide. Anyone here wants to give a definition of ecocide? How many of you have heard of it? Okay, I'll ask you for your definition afterwards then. It's basically massive destruction of the environment. I mean, there are different ways you could talk about it, but it's the intentional destruction. So there's a lot more interest in the companies. There's a lot more lawsuits. That's where the ecocide concept is important because it could potentially be a future international law to hold these companies and the people who run them responsible. The Guardian ran a series in the autumn about the polluters, quantifying their emissions and looking at how much lobbying they were doing. And just a few days ago, Bloomberg published a ranking. They've ranked the top 10 billionaires in the world based on the amount of their wealth which is connected to greenhouse gas emissions, which is a really important advance. So those methodologies could be applied and we can get even more information and a kind of better picture of what's going on. And I suppose all of this really is just to illustrate historical responsibility. So at the moment, as I said, the main debates are between countries. So China says US has massive emissions, the US says it's all China's fault. We can kind of just carry on going around like that and just not really get anywhere. But there's also within countries, there's this massive inequality. And then actually we're talking about the polluter elite and the richest. We know that they're hypermobile. I mean, they may be a resident in a country, but in a way they're part of an international elite. So there's more and more interest in that. And so whilst it is important for all of us to think about our own lifestyles, it is also important to see that, particularly on the investment side, that these people hold greater historical responsibility. So it's not that we are all equally responsible. Okay, another question. Let's see what happens this time. Who can tell me what the Climate Change Act is? Nobody. Nobody was around in 2008.
Have a crack. It's when climate change targets are made legally binding.
Exactly. Climate change targets were made legally binding. It was, I think it was 80% reduction by 2050. Now the reason that this law was so important is that, well, it was a first basically, and it was a government setting targets for a nation to actually act on climate change. So we just heard about the failure of the most recent climate change conference in Madrid. Well, this was domestic level action, which potentially was huge. The problem is that as I was doing my research, particularly on the political influence of the Polluter Elite, this is in the US and the UK, and it's the same pattern, is what happens is whilst there's progress, at some point, so like the Climate Change Act, there's then reversals. And in this country, one of the big reversals was the Oil and Gas Authority being set up in 2015. Now this was after the Infrastructure and the Energy Acts of 2015-2016, which basically set the policy, so the UK government policy, to maximise economic recovery of oil and gas. Just let that sink in for a second if you haven't heard that before. That is actually the current government policy. Whatever else you hear, that is what our government is doing, and that's what the Oil and Gas Authority is mandated to do to facilitate. So bonus question, can anyone guess who the government commissioned to do the background research on the Oil and Gas Authority?
BP?
Some people say BP. Anyone else? Shell. Anyone else? ExxonMobil. I think you get the idea. It wasn't actually any of them. It was somebody called Sir Ian Wood. Guess what the company that Sir Ian Wood was running for a long time, guess what it does? Yeah, basically it provides services for oil and gas companies in the North Sea, well, and globally, but he's I think the richest person in Aberdeen. So it's just another example of the access that these people have over government policy. All his recommendations were taken up and the Oil and Gas Authority was created. So, as I've said, my work is focusing on linking inequality and environment, linking those two issues, which basically, I mean, it's the same issue, which is why they shouldn't be separate in the first place, but there's massive inequality in this country, the same in the US. Wealth is being concentrated, so taxes on income and wealth, and crucially corporation tax, are either falling or much lower than they have been in the past. And that means that the richest people have more resources. These companies have more resources. There was an article that came up quite recently that Shell paid hardly any tax in about 2 years ago. That means they have more money to spend on lobbying and on their greenwash, of course. So we just need to factor that in, because whilst there may be more awareness of the climate and ecological crisis, the same actors that are responsible are becoming even more powerful. And the point of looking at the individuals running the companies as a group, it's never just as one person, is that they will never give up. So like you were discussing the cycle on the Polluter Elite slide, it is personal for them. I mean, this is their high carbon lifestyle. They're not going to just give it up if we say, can you stop doing this, please? Can you stop making money from extracting oil? They're just not going to do it. And before we get to what we can do about it, another thing to understand is that all of this is happening in a context where there's the issue of structural power. So our government, basically, it isn't just about them having more and more scientific information or another report by the UN on the kind of gravity or kind of making the links, if you pollute, there will be climate change. There's also the issue of our governments depend on the provision of energy for economic growth, for investment, for jobs. So at the moment, that's mainly from oil, gas and coal. And so the people who provide that are have the advantage, basically. So there's a dependency between the companies who provide that energy source and the government that needs it. So like the thing of the lights not going out, that kind of thing. I mean, I think you get the idea. So it's just another factor in understanding that government inaction is not coincidence. It's not just there are stupid people in government who don't understand climate science, but there are really big structural factors going on. Now, probably getting to the best part of the talk, which is what do we do about it? So first I'll present what needs to happen, and then we'll see if we're going to be able to do it. So, what can be done when our government is so heavily controlled by these companies? I'll give you some examples of how that's happening. I mean, the most obvious thing, and it's difficult, is we need to reduce our profits. And we need to take away their social license to operate. So right now, I've heard from friends here at Oxford that there are people occupying a college here to call on it to divest from fossil fuels. How many of you were aware of that? Most of you. Great. And some people can't be here apparently because they are doing occupation right now. Now, fossil fuel divestment is the people who first kind of created it and set it up, they were very clear that one of the goals of it was to take away the social license to operate, which is basically the legitimacy of these companies to exist, to do what they do, to be seen as providing a service as wouldn't go as far as saying a public good, but basically being allowed to operate and having that endorsement to do that. So if we take away that social license to operate, and one of the ways to do that is to call for fossil fuel divestment, then we can actually undermine their power. But as I pointed out, their power is growing, so it's even more urgent to do that. Now there are several things that we can call for which would hurt their profits. So one would be to stop giving them our money in the first place. How many of you knew that currently there are tax breaks worth billions of pounds for these companies to extract oil and gas in the North Sea? Some of you. We should all know that. I mean, that is a scandal. That money could be used in other ways, for renewables, etc. It could be used for anything, to be honest, but it's currently going to them. I mean, there are estimates of exactly how much is being given away. You can look at the Sea Change report if you want more information on that. And the kind of overall what needs to happen, and this is stating the obvious, but would obviously destabilise them, is a coordinated phase out of fossil fuels, crucially with just transition. Now that might sound crazy, but actually some countries have already implemented policies that would potentially start that phase out. So the Stockholm Environment Institute published a report on this just in November. They gave a few examples. In France, there's a policy to phase out all oil and gas production within the country and its overseas territories by 2040. And in Canada, there's a moratorium on offshore oil and gas. They still have the tar sands, obviously, which is hugely problematic, but they have at least stopped it in other areas. Now, why is it important to call for a just transition as part of this policy? How many people have heard of just transition as a concept? Does anyone want to chuck out a definition, or are you going to get me to do it? Anyone? What's a just transition?
So just transition is changing the economy and the way we act and the way we consume so that the poorest people don't just lose their jobs and have to stop heating their homes and have to do everything and bear the brunt of it and the richest carry on as they are. But a just transition is like changing the whole system so that the richest, those with the broadest shoulders are actually bearing the most, like genuinely, and you don't just vilify the poorest people.
Okay, so there are actually multiple definitions of a just transition. So there isn't one answer to that, in case you were wondering. So anyone else, you can also answer it again. But so one component of it is justice in terms of it affecting the people who, as you said, have the broadest shoulders and not affecting the poorest the most, whether that's in terms of heating or transport. So not penalising those people. Does someone else want to add another component of a just transition?
Must be something to do with moving jobs over, so you don't lose your job, you have a different job.
Yes, so there's a transfer of jobs. There are some sectors that will have to disappear, like fossil fuels, and there'll be other sectors which will need to appear or become stronger, greener sectors. Is someone else over there? Sure.
Yeah, so also about not blaming other countries that are going through their own sort of industrial revolution. So countries that at the moment are producing a lot of energy because that's how we got there, and making sure that countries who are already there help them to become more sustainable and make sure that we're not just blaming them for polluting and not doing anything with it.
Okay, so there's also the international dimension, which is recognising historical responsibility of countries like our own, that have caused more of the problem for longer since the Industrial Revolution, and that there are other countries that have not put so much pollution into the atmosphere or destroyed their environment, and therefore they should have a bit more space to grow. Someone else?
I don't know whether you would include this, but I think just transition would involve lowering growth. Now, you put on the previous screen, oh, you've got to have growth, or we all disappear in a puff of smoke. And I think lowering growth and changing the money system is probably necessary to achieve a just transition.
So, yes, thank you for that. I hope most people heard what was said. It's kind of part of that same debate about levels of economic growth, types of economic growth, how the economy should be structured. And so I would say that probably what you said, thank you for that, it's very, very useful, is, in a way, it's what's our vision of the economy and what do we actually need to be produced and consumed. In this case, I'll just talk a little bit more about the jobs, in a way the transfer, as it were. So some people will lose their jobs because there are some sectors which are destroying the planet. So that sector cannot exist. But there are different ways to do that. So in the North Sea, at the moment, there's a big debate raging about how that transition should happen. And in fact, one of the oil and gas lobby groups just published their own statement about how they are definitely part of that transition and they really want to see it happen. Not sure I really believe them, but anyway, the point is that there are options of how this can happen. It can basically be a sudden shutdown, which is where it can be to do with fluctuations in the oil price, or it could be because there was a sudden move to decarbonise the economy, or it can be managed. And this is something which is that there are people who try to engage oil workers, direct and indirect, up in the North Sea on this issue, to basically say there are other options. I mean, wind power actually is going through Aberdeen at the same time as the oil and gas rigs, and there is actually some kind of overlap in the services and in the people who work in those industries. So there are ways that it can happen, and I will talk about that a bit later on. Now, moving to the next question. Can public pressure from groups such as the Youth Climate Strikers, Wretched of the Earth, Black Lives Matter, XR, can it actually really transform the situation? Deliberate destabilisation of the polluter elite will be incredibly difficult because there's actually never been an energy transition which has needed to happen so quickly and to go one way. So like I explained before about the Climate Change Act and the Oil and Gas Authority, kind of progress and then reversal, we needed to go one way and very, very quickly. Now to do that will mean building countervailing power to the political power of the fossil fuel companies. So speak to the person next to you just for a few minutes. What do you think the role of XR and other social movements is in trying to do that?
opportunity to really how far can that go? I don't know what other way they can do to protesting. Maybe they've got to protest in the building. Figure out what I was going to do. Buy the electric car, full one. I don't know if that no idea if it's yeah, that's coming in. No, I've got to go. I've got to go. It's good to get everyone together.
Yeah, they definitely. It's right.
I'll go back in. A little bit. Not too much. That's good. I am doing it when I'm having like my job work or something. Get yeah.
Great to hear you having so many conversations. You all seemed a bit perplexed when I asked the question, but you've got ideas from somewhere, so that's great to see. I won't ask you for them now. We'll talk about them afterwards, or you can bring them up in the Q&A. So, I think I've probably made it clear so far. The point is that the space for the green transition has to be bought. It doesn't just exist. Just because things like the costs of solar and wind energy are falling, there's no automatic reason that fossil fuels get replaced. What's happening at the moment is renewable energy is growing fast alongside fossil fuels. That's in almost every country around the world, including in this country. So speed really matters here. This needs to happen very quickly. As Rachel was presenting on in the kind of start of this talk, not much has happened over quite a long time, and it needs to happen really quickly. So we need to bear that in mind when you hear the greenwash of companies or even governments in some cases where they're saying, yes, we agree with you, we want to do this, and isn't it terrible, and we should sort this out. They want to do it in long time frames. They want to delay action. So the space for this new economy has to be opened up, and it has to be opened up also understanding that those companies are going to try and lobby to close it. Now the good news is that there are many social movements, some that existed before and new ones, which are opening up that space. I just wanted to highlight from this slide Black Lives Matter, which is the top right. How many of you have heard of this group? Quite a few of you. Now, what they did is they occupied in the picture there a kind of portion of London City Airport, in 2016. They were making those links very clearly between those responsible, the impact of climate change, particularly on the poorest, most marginalised, and in this case, people of colour. And making those links between what are seen as environmental issues with social issues will be absolutely fundamental. So, and also, obviously, what Extinction Rebellion has been doing, the youth climate strikers, building on that previous work, is opening up that space. And this is what really terrifies the polluter elite, because what they don't want is for people to be coordinated and complementing each other. So they will try and destroy anything that comes out of the Citizens' Assembly, or the youth climate strikers want a Green New Deal. They'll try and stop it before it even happens, or if it does happen, they'll try and undermine it afterwards. So the only way things are going to change is if ordinary people actually start to mobilise, which is what's happening. And I think that maybe the kind of previous part of my talk was about how powerful these companies are. In a way, it's kind of terrifying to realise that it is actually down to us, but in some ways it's also liberating. So, a quick question. You can see there cutting from a newspaper article that the RSC dropped BP in a sponsorship deal. Who actually got them to do that? Do you know? It wasn't just Mark Rylance. I mean, he was involved, and he did his publicly said he was going to leave. But it was over years and years of ordinary people who decided this needs to happen. So BP, not BP, and others are just small grassroots organisations who just decided this is not right. BP should not be sponsoring cultural institutions. They will be at the British Museum next Saturday, calling on that institution to drop BP. And it's going to be a huge demonstration, lots of people involved. The point I'm trying to make is that change can happen, and it can happen from just the general public saying this is not good enough. Okay, now I move to the next slide. Oops. So, as I said, this political space has been opened up, and actually in the election just a month ago, or well, kind of several weeks of it, there was competition between parties on green policies. Now that hasn't been seen since 2007-2008 period. Now for those of you who were listening earlier in the presentation, what happened in 2008? Climate Change Act, exactly. That only happened because of civil society and a whole range of people, business and people in government pushing for that. Otherwise it wouldn't have been created. It's not like it came out of nowhere. Now what's interesting is at that time there was competition between parties to be seen as green, and there is again today. And that is down to all of these mobilisations. Now whether you believe a certain political party or not, and whether they want to implement what they've promised, in some ways that's not so much the point. The point is that they're all having to pretend to do it. And that is because of people like you in this room. And so even though, we now know who's going to be in government for the next few years, it was always going to be down to social movements and civil society to push through the green transition at the speed and at the scale that's needed, regardless of who was in government. So that was always the case. And it is right to focus on government because they have the legitimacy and the authority to make these big changes, which, let's be honest, will affect all of our lifestyles. So it is the right target to choose. But for government to be able to actually make those changes, there has to be enough public support. So Extinction Rebellion has a choice at the moment. It can either stay as an environmental movement, which is how it's perceived, or it can be part of catalysing something much bigger. And that means not just appealing to people who want to be rebels, it means appealing to people outside of that as well. It means wider public. It means, for example, not disrupting the public in ways that don't make sense to them. I'll get to that in a second. It also means focusing on targets, and hopefully by now you're probably quite clear on who I think should be targeted, and that is, for example, the fossil fuel companies, also the banks that finance them. And if Extinction Rebellion chooses those kind of targets, then actually that makes sense. I mean, those are the people responsible, but potentially also gets support from other parts of the movement who have been more critical of Extinction Rebellion for lacking a kind of focus on global justice. So people like Rachael Treharne and Black Lives Matter. So that's a way of focusing on these global companies, because they have terrible impacts globally, is a way to connect with environmental defenders in the global south who are also facing the same companies. And also, just to mention very quickly, in terms of telling the truth, it's important to say loud and clear that when we're calling for a green transition, that doesn't just mean massive extractivism in the global south. It doesn't just mean lots more mining. There are ways to do this transition that do not just mean more and more people's livelihoods and lands are destroyed in the global south. Now, in terms of how to disrupt, the reason that I put that image on the top left is because it really was symbolic of something that didn't really go that well in October, to put it mildly. Does anyone want to shout out what that top left image is of, apart from reading the name? What happened there during the rebellion in October of last year?
It was jumping on top of a train
Someone jumped on the train
and stopped people getting to work.
and started getting to work.
And really annoyed other people, so they pulled them off and would have duffed them up had they not been stopped.
And they were pulled off the train for that, and were hurt quite badly. Now, the point of putting that image on there and to discuss this is because what happened in October is certain sections of the media, and also the government in some ways, they were successful in presenting a narrative of protesters versus commuters. Now, this is the exact kind of false division. It's false, by the way. Many people who were protesting commuted together. I mean, there's lots of overlaps. It's not that anyone is only one thing. It is a false division. But to break down that false division, Extinction Rebellion needs to choose targets, like the ones I've mentioned, which do not directly disrupt the public in that way, and do target the people who are most responsible. So I suppose the kind of what I'm trying to emphasize is social movements come and go. That's actually their history. So Extinction Rebellion doesn't have unlimited chances to choose kind of where it disrupts. So probably there will never be 100% of the population who agree, but that doesn't mean that there can't be more sympathy from the broader population. And the other images on this slide are examples of more targeted actions. So the one in the middle was done by XR Families outside the Treasury. That was in April and in October. And that was to call for particularly the end of the tax breaks for the fossil fuel companies in the North Sea. You can probably guess who was behind that action. And the links that were made there were with air pollution. And the point is that, as I said before, it's really important to make those links, social, environmental, etc. In fact, as I said, they are the same. Talking about something like air pollution, lots of people can understand that. They can understand that they don't want it to happen, and it cuts across backgrounds, class, etc. The image in the top right is an action at BlackRock. Anyone want to tell me what BlackRock do or how terrible they are? No, okay. You get the point. They're one of the biggest. They actually came up a lot in the Polluter database because when I was seeing who were the executives and the directors who have their shareholding, the only other shareholders who are made visible in the annual reports are big financial institutions when they hold around 5% of the company. And guess who came up again and again? BlackRock. So that's why there's this protest, and particularly because they fund a lot of companies that are responsible for deforestation in the Amazon. So again, that's going straight to the source, what fuels are causing the problem. Can anyone tell me what's happening in the bottom left image? Greenpeace, activists, anyone else? Anyone want to be more specific? Want to risk it?
Was it XR people in Aberdeen for Shell?
It was XR Scotland, and it was a rig, I think it was near to Dundee, and it was a Shell rig, exactly. So you get the points. But everyone else said Greenpeace. It was similar to what Greenpeace did, but it was Extinction Rebellion. This was just about 3 weeks ago. Extinction Rebellion Scotland did a whole series of actions. They blocked the HQ of Shell for around a day, well, as in kind of 7 a.m. to around 7 p.m. They did this action where several very brave and inspirational women went up this rig to slow it down, basically. It was in the harbour, I think it was. And they did other actions. And it was amazing because they have very few resources and not that many people. And they managed to achieve a lot. And they spooked the fossil fuel companies and the industry. They put out statements like, silly stunts will not be part of solving the climate crisis and things like that. And so it's kind of now open warfare, as it were, around this issue in the North Sea, because there's going to be the climate change conference in Glasgow at the end of this year. So XR Scotland, like I said, they did these actions. The industry has come out saying they're part of the solution. I'll leave that up to you, what you think about that. There's now going to be a lot more of this. But this is somewhere where the rest of Extinction Rebellion could provide support in terms of people, resources, time, and that's going to be absolutely fundamental in this year when the climate change conference is in Glasgow. And what's interesting about what XR Scotland have done so far and what they could do in the future is they've made it very clear in their messaging as part of the just transition. So they're making it clear that they're not doing this so that people who work in this industry lose their jobs and kind of that's it. They are making those links, they're making the social and environmental links to say we want a new kind of economy in Scotland and we want everyone to prosper and to benefit from that. So just to end on this, the climate change conference in Glasgow is probably going to be a failure. I can tell you that because I was at these conferences 10 years ago, and some of the debates are the same debates. And one of the major factors for why the conferences have failed ever since they started in the 1990s is, guess who? The polluter, the fossil fuel companies. They've been undermining it since day one. They have a huge influence over national government positions. It's the national governments who then go to negotiate with each other. And if so many of them are co-opted and controlled by these fossil fuel companies, it's no surprise that the outcome is failure, regardless of how many people are on the streets. So we really do have a responsibility this year to actually disrupt these companies and to take them on and to really highlight the role of the polluter. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. So, I don't know how you guys felt when that talk was going on, but quite a lot of it I felt pretty depressed because I saw that circle picture at the beginning with everybody in the middle protesting and then all the money moving around the outside from, you know, contracts to fossil fuels to private yachts to the electoral system. And it feels pretty depressing and you feel powerless. And it's also really hard after the last election when we saw the progressives kind of fighting each other and now we've got a party in power that are in the hands of the fossil fuel lobby for the next 5 years. And I think it's really worth just acknowledging like this exhaustion that I certainly feel, but I think probably quite a lot of people feel. So you've got the exhaustion of knowing the science and suddenly being like, oh my God. But then you've also got the powerlessness of this feeling of these like big, impossible companies that are run by these very powerful people who don't seem to mind that they're pushing us towards the end of the world as they know, as we know it. And it's also the exhaustion of running a social movement. Like, lives have been changed by Extinction Rebellion, and the minutes are exhausting, and meetings are exhausting, and the internal politics is exhausting, and sometimes you really just don't want to do it anymore. And I think it's really worth just saying that. But unless we're just going to go hide away and like make your own life as perfectly carbon neutral as you possibly can, which you can't do in this system, all we have is each other. Like, that's it at the end of the day. And so I wanted to be able to say something other than keep going and keep being angry and keep loving each other. But there isn't really anything more to say than that in many ways. And we are a very imperfect movement. Like, we've spent the first 18 months growing incredibly quickly. We've definitely made mistakes. Like, really, Canning Town was pretty awful. But we're as imperfect as people are imperfect. There's many parts of each person who's wonderful, brilliant, and kind and generous, and many parts that are selfish and thoughtless and ignorant and everything. And so a collection of people is unsurprisingly exactly like that. But the wonderful thing about being a movement and not an organisation is that we can do anything we want. So if we want to target the Oil and Gas Authority, Extinction Rebellion in Oxford can make that the primary target of the next rebellion. If we want to target luxury car showrooms or helipads or the obvious signs of the polluter elite, to make it that link clear to the public, not because I think we're going to shut down the polluter elite's lifestyle, but to start making that link obvious, we can do that. And nobody is going to give us permission to do that, so we can just decide to do it. And that's the really, really wonderful thing. And Dario has mentioned this as well, but this really is the time. Like, COP26 is, I don't know if it is already going to be a failure, but putting that pressure on the government and on the polluter elite this year is probably the most important thing we can possibly do. And I feel like every single year I've said, this is the most important year, this is the most important year, this is the most important year. But it is, because not only are we getting closer and closer and closer to whatever the tipping points are on an ecological and environmental basis, it's also the UK's, time in terms of running COP26, and we are in that country. So it is our responsibility. And pressure does work. I know it's hard because you're in this bubble of Extinction Rebellion people, and you think you're how much impact are we having especially after the election and all this kind of stuff. But XR has possibly been a bit of a blunt tool in its first couple of years, but we have done the initial bit of waking everybody the fuck up, basically. And so it is up the agenda in a way that it has never been before. And so that pressure does work. But now I think it's the time we've gone really wide, we've gone really big and a bit blunt, and now we kind of focus in. Now we've built a kind of movement. So in terms of what we can actually do, I've got a couple of ideas, a bit of advice, and then there's some specific things that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about. And then I thought we could either go into Q&A type thing, if you want to do Q&As. I think Q&As have a certain limited role, but then I think there's also a space in this room for people to actually talk to each other and start to plan something. But some of the things that are really close to my heart is about getting out of the bubble and talking about climate change with people who don't normally talk about climate change. And if you don't know how to do this, I can really recommend Climate Outreach, who are an amazing climate change communication organisation in Oxford. And they have an actual course on how to talk about climate change with ordinary people and bring it up in your life. And I know people who have got their New Year's resolution is to have one conversation about climate change every day with somebody they don't know, which is terrifying. I can stand up in front of all you very easily, but talking to people who I never talk to about climate change, I find completely terrifying. So stopping fighting each other, worrying about being ideologically pure, endlessly talking about the things that are very divisive, which we know are generally about diets and energy sources, and actually starting to reach out to other people with easily accessible messages is so important. And I'm talking in person and on social media. But also it's about whatever you can do. So if you can write. If you can talk. If you can organise things, then organise things. If you can do admin behind the scenes, then do admin behind the scenes. So there is literally something for everyone. And if you do want to find out more about XR, come and talk to me or talk to various people in the room who could wave their hand. Anna, can you wave your hand? Rachel, can you wave your hand? So some of these people know a lot about Extinction Rebellion if you don't know that much. And then specifically, next Saturday, as Dario mentioned, is a massive, massive protest at the British Museum. So the British Museum are sponsored by BP, and BP, or not BP, which are the arts theatre group who put all that pressure on the RSC and got them to drop BP, are doing a huge, very exciting protest next week. And it's the exhibition is about Troy, about ancient Greece, and there might be a very, very large Trojan horse, which may or may not get into the British Museum, may or may not contain human beings. I genuinely can't tell you any more than that, so I don't know. So that's next Saturday, 11 o'clock at the British Museum. If you want to come to that, please come to that. But most importantly is to keep up the pressure this year with actions before COP. I think that is the single most important thing. So if you have been inspired by today and you want to put all that scary, powerless feeling into something good, then what I think we'll do is just go over this side if you want to carry on talking to Rachel and Dario about and ask questions.
I wonder if I could just ask one question of the audience before some of them depart. How many people have seen the email from me about finding people of influence? Thank you. I got some answers last time. It seems to be extraordinarily inefficient, but yet I believe, and so do Rupert Reed and Rock Sanford, they think it's a brilliant idea. It's not happening. Now, it must be me, my journalist skills failing completely. I don't know, I really don't know what to say, because the idea is that you go back to your families, your friends, your hairdresser, your dentist, and ask them if they know people of influence. Obviously, the dentist and the hairdresser have to ask permission before they give you the name of the person of influence, and then you speak with them and ask them what they want to do with their power. Now, if you find a very powerful person, then XR, oh dear, it begins with CY. Anyhow, it's a group. And they've just been at Davos. They're all honed up to go and speak with very powerful people.
Okay, so that's one idea that Sarah has over here. But what we'll do next, so if you want to leave, you can leave if you need to go and do your life. But if you want to stay and talk to Rachel, you can. And we'll stay over here if you want to stay and talk to Rachel. And that's more like Q&A type thing. We'll try and do it in like a group so it doesn't interrupt the other group. If you want to do something that is an action related to this, come over this side, and then you can all talk amongst yourselves and start planning something. And that could include just meeting up next week at the BP or not BP thing. It could just be like who's going to that. So it's a kind of self-organising voting with your feet moment. And apart from that, thank you very much for coming, and make sure you put the donation into the pot.
Yeah, that's cool.